Good morning, dear distinguished friends. Friday, April 29th. Koyach Nissen, Chav Ches Nissen. And it's Friday. We're in the tail end of chapter 15. Our dear friend Mark, I guess it's close to Shabbos, but as he pointed out, odds are that Monday will be the Siyum, but we're on the march. And we're studying Maseches Shabbos, chapter 15, Kufya Dalet Amud Beis 114b. And we're talking until where we are now, which the conversation changed. We're talking about garments and clothing. And so we had a whole detour yesterday to talk about Olam Haba and Tchias HaMesim. You never know, as their Beryl points out occasionally, you never know what we're going to get ourselves into in this Gemara Shir. And in general, when you study Gemara, you have the opportunity to cover a very wide variety of topics, halachic and otherwise. But now we're talking about the interesting complication of when we go from Yontif to Shabbos, Shabbos to Yontif, Yom Kippur to Shabbos, or Shabbos to Yom Kippur. And indeed, it is complicated because there are restrictions, a variety of practices and behaviors that are restricted not only on Shabbos, but on Yontif. And so can you prepare? Can you do malacha that possibly is allowed on Shabbos, but could you do that on a Yontif, preparing for a Shabbos, or vice versa? Again, to point out, when we're talking about rituals in the temple, there was a waiver for the ongoing temple rituals to be done on Shabbos. So, for example, the Torah itself prescribes to bring a oilas, to bring a daily offering, a tamid, and that was brought on Shabbos. There were other special karbonis that the Torah prescribes uniquely for Shabbos, and those are brought on Shabbos. As a matter of fact, when we daven Musaf on Shabbos, we reference the verses that describe the karbonis of Shabbos, and that's what the Musaf prayer does, is it commemorates the bonus offerings that are brought on Shabbos. So obviously, although slaughtering we don't do on Shabbos, and blood and burning and all those things are not done on Shabbos, in the narrow, limited sense that it's part of temple ritual, there was a waiver. Of course, that waiver did not extend to the construction of the Mishkan, and that is the source for a lot of our discussions about the malachas.
Rabbi, wouldn't all of this be in Eruvim?
No, Eruvin in principle is about the limited issue of carrying or enclosing a domain that's not a Rishus HaYachid and turning it into a more enclosed Rishus HaYachid. Whereas here we're talking about malachas, which is appropriately in Shabbos. Now, maybe what you meant to say is that some of it belongs, and indeed it can be found in Maseches Beya or Beitza, which talks about Yontif. And so whenever there is the discussion of the crossover of Shabbos to Yontif, Yontif to Shabbos, well then, a good chance that some of those matters that we're going to be referencing are from Maseches Beitza, which talks about Yontif, Yontif-oriented matters. And so we found essentially two opinions, two shitot, in our Mishnah, Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Yishmael is inclined to permit Yom Kippur to service Shabbos, meaning if there's something that's left over from Shabbos, it could be burnt on Yom Kippur and not vice versa. And Rabbi Akiva has a much more machmir, in a sense, standpoint, which is that no work can be done on Yontif or Shabbos for another day. That was, in a long way, what our Mishnah states. Yesterday's Gemara was drawing a parallel or digging deeper into the mindset of Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yishmael, and we pointed out that most likely Rabbi Yishmael believes that the verse Oilas Shabbos b'Shabbatai teaches us you could burn something from Shabbos and Yom Kippur, because to him it is a given that certain karbonis can be brought on Yontif. According to Rabbi Akiva, where you cannot bring karbonis on Yontif, well then we would need Oilas Shabbos b'Shabbatai to teach us that you could burn the remaining components of a Shabbos carbon on Yom Kippur. On Yontif. If Rabbi Akiva believes that you need a limud just to teach you about burning stuff from Shabbos onto Yontif, well then he would obviously not extend that license to Yom Kippur at all. It's complicated, whatever, but I just wanted to give you a fast recap of yesterday's Gemara, and today we're going to continue along the lines of that very discussion, the influence and the halachis of going from Shabbos to Yontif and Yontif to Shabbos and Yom Kippur to Shabbos and Shabbos Yom Kippur. And as Mark pointed out last time we met, this year Shavuos, I believe, goes Shabbos and then Yontif. So it's going to be a Shabbos, Sunday, Monday, or as we like to call it, a 3-day Yontif. So buckle up and get ready. All right, let's just find the Gemara here. Share the screen and get started. So that was what we discussed. We ended off in the middle of a discussion about Rabbi Zera, who said that he reminded us, or we were reminded of his journey from Bavel to Israel. And initially he had an understanding about blowing of the shofar between Shabbos and Yom Kippur, or Yom Kippur and Shabbos, to denote, or the absence of the shofar. Initially, he thought this was a unanimous viewpoint that everybody held, because usually we sound the shofar just to alert people that certain prohibitions are going to begin. And everyone agrees that you can't do malachim from Shabbos to Yom Kippur. But he said later on, I came to the conclusion, or I was informed by Yehuda, that actually only Rabbi Akiva holds you don't blow the shofar. And Rabbi Yishmael says you can blow the shofar. Why? Because Rabbi Yishmael believes that there are certain leniencies of Yom Kippur over Shabbos, and therefore when you're going from Yom Kippur to Shabbos, people need to know that stuff has gotten a little more machmir. That was, again, the closing conversation we had. And then we ended off with the words, Rabbi Yehuda, son of Shimon ben Pazi, says, I commented, how can you say that you need to sound the shofar to let the people in the temple know that they must stop certain acts that are prohibited on Shabbos? Kohanim's rizenheim. Kohanim are well-versed. They are fluent and full of alacrity to observe and adhere all the laws. And so they don't need a reminder. They don't need an alarm clock. And I know what you're wondering. You're wondering what I'm wondering. Since when? You think a kohen is born? Zoriz is a kohen born with a chip that informs him all of the temple rites and rituals and regulations that he's going to need to, we don't need to give any reminders? That doesn't sound right. As a matter of fact, you could be born to a very wise and knowledgeable person, and regretfully, that information doesn't transfer at birth. And children many times could be very different than their parents. So what is this assumption? So I think the easiest way to explain that is simply, we're not saying that all kohanim are zaris. What we're saying is that if you're a trained and certified priest in the temple, well, then you're part of a culture and you've gone through training, which hopefully makes you highly informed and highly on call and committed to the observance of the temple. You might not like that either, but I believe that's like pshat. That's what it says. Not kohanim's rizimim. If a kohen is born, there's zoris. But if you're a kohen who's involved in the temple staff, you've been trained and vetted to make sure that you're very well versed and also very high energy and ready to respond. Yes. I'm sorry, someone was saying something.
It only says Rizim. It doesn't say Makdimim. I wonder why.
So it's interesting. Zor is usually we associate with speed, right?
Right.
But Rashi here, his initial word is not speed, it's fluency, Baki'inhim. So it's interesting here. It's not so much how fast they're going to respond. It's just that they're very well trained. And I think that helps us take away some of the mystique and some of the, the faith-based assertion that a kohen is Zoriz, and that it's part of the vetting process and part of the training. And I believe that is probably the primary pshat. So I'm sorry to the kohenim on here. Although in other contexts, we'll say that, yeah, kohenim maybe had a tendency to be hotheads and to be very reactive, which in the context of interpersonal could be a problem. And in the context of being very dedicated to the temple, maybe that's a good thing. But Anyways, we have Rashi, Zrizim, Bekinim. They're very well, they're very fluent. Just want to see if anybody else weighs in on the matter before we continue. Well, the Gemara itself will, okay, so the Gemara answers. So following this conversation, wherein Rabbi Yehuda, son of Shimon ben Pazi, Rabbi Zera said, originally I thought everybody agrees there's no shofar sound. And eventually I learned that from Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi, that not everybody says you don't need the shofar blast. Rabbi Shmuel says you do need the shofar blast. And the reason for the shofar was to inform the temple folks about the rules and regulations. And then Rabbi Zera asked, I don't understand. Kohanim know everything. They don't need a shofar. That was his conversation. Mark Shisha asked Rav Chizda an interesting question, which some of us might like and some of us might not like. Mi'amrinan Kohanim's reasoning. Is this a real thing? Is this a thing? Kohanim's reasoning? Where'd you pick that up? Can we be so certain that the Kohanim know everything that they don't need a shofar blast to remind them? So now we're going to get a little bit more into the theory behind the shofar blasts that would be sounded. So again, a reminder. We read in our Mishnah earlier on, who recalls where we open another window. Bear with me a moment. Somewhere over here, hold on. Where's the Mishnah? Yitana Rabbanan. Sheish Kiyos Toikin Erev Shabbos. There was a tradition. Again, this is the Gemara Lamed Hayom and Beis. There were 6 shofars blasts. Rishona, Lahavtil Amim Lacha Shabbos Adis. This was to tell everyone to stop working. Shniel Lahavtil Ir Vechanuyos. The next blast, which happened a little later, was to remind the folks that were in the city, which it's faster and easier to close up shop and be timely for Shabbos. Shlishis Lahavdik Hasaner. And then the third one was to a reminder to light the candle. Tefillin. The third shofar sound was to say, take off your tefillin. And then there's some time for some cooking. And then Tekeh Maria Tekeh, and there was a final 3 blasts, and that was the sign Vishavis that Shabbos has arrived.
So they were wearing tefillin the whole day?
Yeah, there's a lot of evidence that in times past, folks would wear tefillin all day. There were certain groups of very devout folks who lived in Yerushalayim. I believe the Prushim, I think, some of the Talmidei Hagra, Dr. Stamel, you'll correct me if I'm getting some of the details wrong, but there were Jews who were very devoted and they would wear tefillin all day in the Beis Medrash. I don't think it was everyone, but there were such folks.
I think today also you have some people who still wear tefillin all day long.
Yeah.
Yeah, at the Kotel, you always
Today you have certain folks that, and also in certain Sephardic communities, it appears that once upon a time, people wore tefillin. People who were engaged in Torah study would wear tefillin all day, and people that went to work would take the tefillin off. Or, so today that's not the
norm.
That's not as prevalent and not really the norm. This is not a judgment to those that do. On the contrary, those that do are essentially asserting that they have a high degree of concentration, focus, and kol hakavod. But anyway, so this is that brisa that talks about the 3 shofar blasts, and so that's
Rabbi,
done.
Do you know if the Gra wore only Rashi or also Rabbeinu Tam?
I don't know. I would not be surprised either way. But those who know more about the Gra, I mean, I've read, but I don't remember. I don't recall. It's likely that he did. Let's Google it, Rabbeinu. Because the Gra in many ways was very mystically and Kabbalistically oriented. Let's see. Well, Google. All right, I'd have to dig a little here. All right, Google so far says that we don't know, but likely he didn't. Oh, I'm sorry. I was remiss. I failed to announce. We said it before the recording, but I just want to say during the recording, we're dedicating today's learning for the neshama of Ephraim Fishel ben Basal Gedalia, and for Esther Bas Avram Yaakov, the neshama Shavan Aliyah. And we're grateful to the pastor next to be part of an important pillar of this year. And so we're honored to dedicate today's learning, now that it's on the recording. Again, Ephraim Fishel ben Basal Gedalia and Esther Bas Avram Yaakov. We should only have good news, healthy news, happy news, and the neshamas should have an aliyah. Thank you, Dr. and Mrs. Pasternak, for allowing us to honor them. All right. So back to the story of the shofar blast. So now that we know why the shofar was sounded, it was to remind people and get them prepared and oriented for Shabbos. But that is all appropriate when you're in the field doing work, and when you're in your store doing work, and when you need to light a candle or you need to do other malacha. But if you're going from Yom Kippur to Shabbos, or rather from Shabbos to from Yom Kippur to Shabbos, or Shabbos to Yom Kippur, what changes? You're in shul, you'll stay in shul. Okay, so you can eat. But I don't think that's what we're talking about here. So that's going to be the Gemara's question. Amar le Mark Kishisha B'Reid Rav Chisda Rav Ashi. Here is the question of Mark Shisha to Rav Ashi. Is it appropriate here to say that the Kohanim didn't need the sounding of a shofar for the purposes of a carbon? Does the conversation begin? There's a brisa that says Shalosh lahavtila sami malacha. 3 shofar blasts were intended to separate the folks from melacha. Vishloisha or shalosh lablu and kodesh l'chol. And then the additional 3 shofar blasts were not there for informational purposes. It was done for Havdalah purposes. Let's look up this Gemara, because I realize we looked up the one in Masechah Shabbos. We should look up the Gemara that's being cited here from Masechah Sukkah just for a moment. And Gimel Amud Beis. Here's a Mishnah. Erev Shabbos, so you might see from Sheish, there were 6 soundings of the shofar, Shalosh lahavdil samim melacha, 3 to let people know that they should stop doing melacha. Shalosh lahavdil ben kodesh l'chol. An additional 3 to let people know that now it is Shabbos. It is no longer chol. Rashi kiddush hayom l'diah shechashecha v'yesh me'at achiv skila b'melacha. To let people know not only should they no longer be working, but there is a biblical consequence for working.
So, by the way,
yes,
I Googled it, and apparently the Rav did not. And I read an interesting story here.
The legend, but it's noted as a legend. It's not in a that he would convince
right.
convince Rabbeinu Tam out of it.
The interesting story that I just read is Moshe Feinstein felt that if you're going to wear Rabbeinu Tam's, which he did, it should only be mehudarim, very, very fancy Rabbeinu Tam filling. And when he left Russia, he his Rabbeinu Tam tefillin were damaged, so he stopped wearing Rabbeinu Tam tefillin. When he came to the United States, and I'll read it to you in Hebrew, עד שהרבי מלובביץ' דאג להשיג לו זוג תפילין של רבנו תם מאותרים. Until the Lubavitch Rebbe made sure to arrange for him to have Rabbeinu Tam's tefillin that were merudarim, and then he started wearing Rabbeinu Tam again.
Yes, shkoyach for sharing that. Yeah, I think the Rebbe told him he'll refer his sofer, and then I think Rebbe Moshe had to review the Parshiyot. So indeed an interesting story. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. There's another legend which I thought you were going to say, which is that the Gra said that if they would have allowed him a few minutes with Rabbeinu Tam, he would have convinced him out of it. But I'm not sure if that sounds like an authentic kind of legend. All right, Vatsanan. So the Brisa says, Shalosh lahavti asamim lacha. And shalish lahavdil ben kodesh lechol. 3 were to let people know to stop. Rashi umani luhu b'tkiyas sheba mikdash. Umani luhu b'tkiyas sheba mikdash. In peichus mechavat kos b'mikdash v'kasak adaitach medit takinon luhu b'mikdash lekeder dekani takilu. So we have shofar blast that happened in the Beis Hamikdash. So if the shofar blast had to happen in the Beis Hamikdash to remind the Kohanim that it's about to be Shabbos, well, then it means that they don't have this meticulous internal clock, and Kohanim too need a shofar blast as a reminder. And by the way, there's no shame in that, but it just doesn't work with the previous assertion that the Kohanim need no shofar blast. The Gemara says, no, you're no, we are still doing this all for the convenience of the non-Kohen population of Jerusalem. Lishar Amad Yerushalayim. This is for the other folks, but the Kohanim, they are on the ball. They don't need any assistance. Rashi Kedam Arbaya Beseder Yom Behar Gimel. Gabi Livresha Shasa Hilni Amalka Al Pischay Shal Heichal B'Shah Shacham Azrachas Nitzay Zeis Hemena VaKol Yedim Shezman Kriyashma Higia. The Gemara describes in Maseches Yoma how there was a special door that would shine when the sun reached the right position. I guess it was constructed to be a kind of sundial that had a special reminder when it was the Zman Kriyashma. And basically, long story short, the Gemara there asserts that this service could not have been for the Kohanim, but it was for the other people of Jerusalem. And so the Gemara establishes that it's possible for there to be soundings of the shofar, but not necessarily because the Kohanes needed it, because of other folks. So and therefore, even if you'll assume the Kohanim are unnaturally on the ball, it would yet be appropriate to sound the shofar according to Rabbi Yishmael, and not according to Rabbi Akiva.
Rabbi.
Yes.
Isn't it strange that today the services revolve around the blowing of the shofar, and when I look here, it's substituting for an alarm clock.
Right.
So how did we go from this to where it's the highlight with the bracha l'shma kol shofar?
I don't understand the question. There was the mitzvah of shofar on Rosh Hashanah and on Yovel, and there were blasts that were used for telling time. In ancient civilization, I think we can all imagine that sound played a more central role in communication in general, because they didn't have radios and they didn't have other.
So in those times, hearing the shofar is no big deal.
Okay, it depends. Everyone had their own, their own way of their own relationship with the sound of the shofar. But I guess you're right. The point you're making is that today it's much more of a novelty. In those days, it probably was less of a novelty. So that's true. From that perspective, you're right. I'm sorry, it took me some time to understand what you're saying. Yeah. So should we feel bad for them? They didn't have the same excitement of the shofar blast. Although Rebero, you can make a counterclaim that we blow it for 30 days in Elul. So doesn't that Doesn't that take away some of the?
Rebero, it's like challah. You can have challah during the week. It's just like bread. However, Erev Shabbos, it takes on a special sanctity of Erev Shabbos. And then you make a motzi in your mind. It's a special time to have challah. Not
you could you could eat an esrog and make esrog jam during the year.
But
I think when something is unique, people see it as somehow more important, and they gravitate to it. So people who are shomer mitzvos, I don't think that Rebero was referring to them as much as the idea of people who just, I can't miss shofar blowing, or I can't miss a seder. Of course, I go to a seder, or the hierarchy of the 5 things maybe that most Jews who are not particularly observant would not think of missing. So I think that maybe that's what Beryl had in mind. How did it come to that?
Yeah,
maybe
to look at it negatively, take a look what happens in the shul after shofar blowing. People head for the exits.
Rebel, I want to make a counterpoint though. Maybe the reason why we have such a powerful association with the shofar blast is because it happens on Rosh Hashanah. Because it happens on a day that we imbue with so much, when I say we, I mean Torah and our tradition imbues with so much significance and tradition. So the sound which is associated with that whole moment takes on a lot of intense emotion and sentiment. And so I don't know what comes first. Is it the sound that reminds us of the day, or is it the day that reminds us of the sound? Or are they both interwoven in a way that you can't really sever the excitement of the significance of the shofar blast and the uniqueness of it? But all told, I'm glad you made that comment, because it allows us to consider, maybe every time they heard the shofar as a reminder, it gives them a little bit of, oh, that's the Beis Hamikdash. There's stuff happening. There's Kedusha. So I don't know. It's interesting. And now we're going to be introduced to another very interesting facet of Yom Kippur law, and in the context of a question for the shofar. So we're saying now that Rabbi Akiva doesn't believe in shofar blast because there's nothing really to distinguish. And, or maybe because, well, anyways, maybe the shofar should be blasted between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, according to everybody. If it goes Shabbos and Yom Kippur, maybe we need to know when it's Yom Kippur. You know why? Because there's a kula, there's a leniency. There's something that you can do on Yom Kippur that you cannot do on Shabbos. If we blow the shofar, it'll inform the folks that on Yom Kippur afternoon, you're allowed to prepare food by plucking off parts of the plant on Yom Kippur. What's the chiddush? Well, usually you're not allowed to prepare from Yontif to weekdays, or from Shabbos to weekdays. Right? You're not allowed to prepare from Shabbos to Chol, and you're not allowed to prepare from Yontif to Chol. That's why you're not allowed to cook. You're allowed to cook on Yontif, but not for the next day. And that's the whole chiddush, that if you make an eruv tavshilin, then you're allowed to cook from one day of Yontif to the other day of Yontif. But otherwise, there's no such thing as cooking from Yontif. I'm sorry, Yontif to Shabbos. Because otherwise, there's no such thing as preparing from Yontif to another day. You're allowed to prepare trimming vegetables on Yom Kippur for when you're allowed to eat. And when is the Jew allowed to eat? In association with Yom Kippur? Not on Yom Kippur, it's the next day. So maybe we need to blast the shofar to tell us that there's a chiddush, there's a kula. On Shabbos, you're not allowed to prepare a salad for after Shabbos, but on Yom Kippur, you can. Rashi, Velitka, Bein Rabbi Akiva, Bein Rabbi Yishmael, according to all the rabbis who we've been discussing, lo idea the kalumi Shabbos, to give notice that Yom Kippur is more lenient than Shabbos. The Yom Kippur shari b'knivas yorek tolosh lenatik holim and aklochem. You're allowed to chop off the leafy part from the vegetable. Kedei lahashvos shimuchanim lechatchem leformim so that they'll be ready and more usable. Interestingly enough, Rashi tells us that in a sense, handling food on a fast day is not enjoyable. It's torture. That's interesting. We're talking about here again trimming. So the Gemara answers, you know why we don't blow the shofar? To teach the people that it's Yom Kippur and therefore there is a certain leniency. You know why we sound the shofar? To teach us of prohibited activities, not to remind us of permitted activities. Because what's the worst case scenario? A Jew doesn't chop his vegetables, he doesn't clean his vegetables on Yom Kippur. He didn't do anything wrong. And so Rabbi Yosef answers, we're not going to push off a rabbinic prohibition, namely sounding the shofar, which is not allowed to be done. We're not going to do that just to inform the community of a heter. Rashi, the sounding of the shofar is not allowed because it's a rabbinic prohibition. The ka'amris, the lidche leidia heter, we blow the shofar just to let everyone know about a heter. The knivas yarek, ein doichen shvus lahater el lesser. We'll blow the shofar to tell people to not do prohibited activities, but not to announce a license. For example, if you go from Yom Tov to Shabbos, well, Yom Tov, there's a whole lot of activities that are permitted and that on Shabbos are prohibited, namely cooking and carrying and all the sub details of those activities. So that's what Rabbi Yosef answers, and it makes sense. You understand the urgency from the standpoint of halacha. There's an urgency to let people know they can't do certain things. Much less urgency to prevent other things. Tosfos points out, by the way, FYI, if we're talking about temple ritual, that's a chumrah, not a kula, because it's essential that the things that need to be burnt are burnt. Anyways, okay. Rav Shisha B'Reid Rav Idi Amar. Rav Shisha B'Reid Rav Idi has a little bit of a different explanation. He says, Shavus Kuraiva Kitiru. If the information gleaned from the Shavus, meaning if you'll sound the shofar, the information that's gleaned is immediately actionable, we would permit it. But Shavus Rechaika, but if the whole delivery, if the whole value, the whole contribution of the Shavus, the shofar sounding, is only for something that's a while off, lo yitiru. So think about it this way. Yom Kippur night, they'll sound the shofar to tell you tomorrow afternoon you can handle your vegetables. That doesn't sound right. Rashi. If the heter was immediate, they would allow it. I'm sorry. Rashi gives a better pshat than I did. Believe it or not. What's a scenario? Okay, so Rashi explains the scenario here is different than I did. We're talking about a Yom Kippur that leads into Shabbos. Yom Kippur leads into Shabbos. And all right, let's read Rabbi Steinsaltz first. They did not permit a remote rabbinic prohibition, such as trimming vegetables, which is only allowed beginning late in the afternoon, several hours after the Stam Kippur. Okay, so I'm actually relieved to know that Rabbi Steinsaltz and Rabbeinu Hanan learned the Gemara the way I taught it. But Rashi has a whole different take. So I'm going to, for the purposes of this moment, let's stick with the initial pshat that Rabbi Steinsaltz and Rabbeinu Hanan. The shofar sounding is not for a heter for now. It's a heter for tomorrow, many, many hours from now. Rashi's take in short is different. Rashi says, we're talking about sounding the shofar, the transition between Yom Kippur and Shabbos, even though the whole reason why you're trimming the vegetables is to cook them, and you can't cook them on Shabbos either. So you're actually not, there's no need to trim the vegetables, but next year you can do it. And so to inform you of the fact that there's a distinction in the halachic status of Yom Kippur and Shabbos, academically, we're not going to allow you to blow the shofar. So again, a student in yeshiva who's learning the fundamentals should know that there are halachic distinctions between Yom Kippur and Shabbos. But being that in the scenario where it goes, Yom Kippur is on Friday and Shabbos is Shabbos there, the halacha is not actionable, well, we're not going to allow you to blow the shofar according to Rashi for academic purposes, only for actionable and immediate purposes. With a little exploration, we could understand why Rashi prefers his take, but for the sake of simplicity, you can understand why Rabbi Steinsaltz embraces the first shots, which again was that it only becomes allowed down the road. Hang on. All right, so let's see the Gemara. Is it so that for an immediately actionable situation, we would allow blowing the shofar? Weren't we taught that if you go from Yontif to Shabbos, we sound the shofar and don't make Havdalah? Rashi, Yontif, to remind everyone to stop doing Yontif, malacha, cooking, etc. You do a shofar to remind people to stop doing malacha, but you don't make Havdalah. Rashi loy mavdilin. B'tfila ve'al hakais, both in prayer and on the kais. Leitiknu leimer Havdalah ela b'yitzias kodesh u'b'chnisas chol.
Watch out, Imam.
Hold on. In the Kiddush of Shabbos, so hello. So just to point out, on Yontif that leads into Yontif, or Shabbos that leads into Yontif, we have, like this year, we have Yak Nahaz, Yayin Kiddush, and there's Man Havdalah. You do Havdalah in Yontif Kiddush that follows Shabbos, but Shabbos that follows Yontif, you don't make Havdalah. Rashi says, what is Havdalah? Both in prayer and ala kais. Leitiknu leimer Havdalah el b'yitzias kodesh v'knisas chol. Basically, you don't make Havdalah, but you do sound the shofar. What about Yontif happening Saturday night? Mavdilin, we do make Havdalah. That's again Yak Nahaz, or at least part of it. The Havdalah parts, but you don't do a Tkiya. Rashi, Motzei Shabbos. The Imchol Yontif and Motzei Shabbos. Yontif is Sunday. Mavdilim b'tfilah ve'alakais. You say Atochen Antono and over Taidienu, and you say Havdalah. Bein kodesh lekodesh mipnei shakodesh chomer yoytze v'nichnas kal. Being that the transition from Shabbos to Yontif is to downgrade the sanctity, but there's no need to make a tkiyah mivayim lahavdil lahavdil. The hayoytze chomer v'ayoyim loyasu shum malacha. Shabbos there's no malacha, and Yontif there's some malacha. Maybe there's value to sound the shofar to let people know that you can do shchita now. You can shecht. To have fresh meat, which is a immediate need. Shvus kraiva. The Gemara therefore concludes a more reasonable reason why there is not Havdalah between Shabbos and Yontif is Kid Rav Yosef, as Rav Yosef taught, which was that Ein Doichen Shvus Lahatir, we don't blow the shofar to convey a leniency, a permissive, a license to do something that you'd otherwise not be allowed to do.
Rabbi.
Yes.
Rabbi, when we have Yom Kippur and Shabbos, before, after, whatever, When are we talking about? When would you blow the shofar?
I'm sorry. Again, what are you saying?
They're blowing shofar between Shabbos and Yom Kippur, this way or that way.
Possibly, yeah.
Yeah. So when would they blow shofar? On Shabbos?
Possibly. In the lead up to Yom Kippur, yes. Or at the very transitional point. Now, to you and me, it sounds unfathomable that we blow the shofar. It's prohibited. We know that, right?
No, obviously that's the question. Yeah.
But the reality is that its prohibition is only midrabanan. And so the Gemara, in the course of analyzing and originally discussing and reviewing this matter, the Gemara is open to considering possibly blowing the shofar if we could come up with a good reason to do so. And we are thus far yet waiting through that with the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael being that you do blow the shofar, and the opinion of Rabbi Akiva being not to blow the shofar.
So this whole discussion is only Shekayim Beis Hamikdash,
Most likely, yes.
because they're far from it at this point, and they're discussing it like it's something they're doing.
Well, the Jewish law is essential, whether you're practicing it or not, whether it's Hilchas the Mashiach, as we say, or not. So, for example, the code of Jewish law doesn't include temple time rituals. But if you look at the Rambam, which I just pulled up while we were talking, Mishnah Torah, Yom Kippur, Shabbos, he brings this question and he says you don't blow the shofar, but that itself was a chiddush.
He used the perfect word, unfathomable to me.
It's unfathomable to us, exactly. By the way, when Mashiach comes, we're going to have a lot of orienting necessary.
We'll need him to wake us up, that's for sure. That shofar for sure.
Yeah. All right, the Gemara, we're now entering our initial descent. And I'm debating maybe winding down here so we can properly be Messiahim and then start the next thing on next Monday. Because the final segment here is an elaboration on the matter of Kinivas, Yerek, trimming the veggies on Yom Kippur. Just before we get excited, I just want to show you the Rambam Paskins here. No, I'm sorry, the Shulchan Aruch Paskins. We permitted certain veggie trimming and nut cracking from the mincha time and onwards. When Yom Kippur is in a weekday. But nowadays, we are inclined to prohibit this. That's interesting. The ha'idna nahagu lasar. It's interesting. In the halacha, we deal with many of the issues that the Gemara are somewhat outstanding. So the Magen Avram, for example, says, well, he explains why. Rashi says that you're removing the leaves that are gross, but it's not considered bayar because they're also somewhat edible. It's not called psoilus. And so it's only a rabbinic problem. In Yom Kippur, they were matter the shvus. So again, what's the problem with this trimming of the vegetables? So according to the Magen Avram, quoting the Gemara, it's an issue of bayar. All right, I'm going to propose we're going to end here just a few minutes early so we can properly address this thing. We'll then have a siyum and we'll start our next chapter, which is actually a very exciting chapter in the world of the Talmud. It's a chapter called Kol Kisvei HaKodesh, and it talks about. So again, I'm giving you a heads up because we're going to meet again on Monday, and we're going to close off this discussion about Yom Kippur, and then we're going to start with a fascinating discussion of what do you do if a fire breaks out and you have stuff of value in the fire, like holy scriptures and works, etc.
Was that Mamatzilin you have?
Yeah. So this is along that line, but here we're talking about Kol Kisvei HaKodesh, which we've actually referenced in passing, but now we're going to have some fun. Hashem self starting next Monday. So stay tuned. I want to wish everyone a wonderful Shabbos. Again, I want to close as we open learning Lilo Nishmas, Ephraim Fischel, Ben Tzala Gedalia, and Esther Bas Avram Yaakov, and in prayerful wishes for good news and healthy news and happy news for all of Klal Yisrael, and most particularly the dear esteemed members of this Chabura, them, their households, for only good news, good health, and happy occasions. And the Yasher Koyach, everyone, for making this Gemara Shir tick, for keeping it fresh and interesting. Thank you all.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbos.
Thank you very much. Shabbat Shalom.
Good.
Mark, send regards to Gans Eretz Yisrael.
Will do. I'll too. Shabbat Shalom. Got another hour to handle it. I'll do.
Concentrate on the shalom part for you, Mark.
Yes, please.
All right, take care.